The Sultan sleeps. He sleeps in the innermost chamber of a fortress that has been designed, with military precision and considerable expense, to make his sleep safe. The walls are thick enough to absorb a siege. The gates are iron. The corridors between the outer world and his bedchamber pass through successive layers of guards, men selected for their loyalty, their competence, and the particular quality of alertness that only fear of failure can sustain across the long hours of a night watch. There are hundreds of them. There are, in some accounts, thousands. The Sultan is not a man who leaves his safety to chance or sentiment. He is a man who understands power, and power has taught him that survival requires investment. He has enemies. All powerful men have enemies. But his enemies are outside the walls, in the political world where armies maneuver and alliances shift and the game of medieval Islamic geopolitics grinds forward with its usual combination of ambition and violence. They are at a distance. They are managed. They are, for now, contained. The Sultan sleeps. And then he wakes. The details of what follows exist in multiple historical accounts with enough consistency to suggest that something like this actually happened, perhaps to Sultan Sanjar of the Seljuk Empire, perhaps to others, the historical record offering variations on the same chilling scenario with the repetition of an event that kept occurring because the people behind it understood exactly what they were doing. Resting on the pillow beside the Sultan's head is a dagger. Poisoned in some accounts. Simply placed in others, the object itself sufficient without any additional elaboration. And beneath it, or beside it, or attached to it in whatever way the person who left it chose to communicate, a message. The specific wording varies across sources, but the meaning does not. You were asleep. We were here. We chose not to act. This time. The Sultan, surrounded by his thousands of guards, in his impenetrable fortress, behind his iron gates, is suddenly, completely, permanently unsafe. Not because anyone has been killed, because everyone now knows that anyone could be. The forbidden archives are open. To understand the order of assassins, you have to understand the problem their founder was trying to solve. Hassan I Sabah was a man of extraordinary intelligence operating in a world that did not accommodate people like him. An Ismaili Shia Muslim in a political landscape dominated by Sunni Seljuk power, a theologian and strategist of considerable sophistication who had arrived, through whatever combination of conviction and calculation shaped such decisions, at a position of absolute irreconcilability with the powers that governed his world. He could not negotiate with them. He could not defeat them in the field. The resources required for that kind of conventional military confrontation were simply not available to him. He could not outlast them through passive resistance. The Seljuk Empire was vast and its army was enormous and its patience for theological dissent was, historically, limited. Hassan needed something else. In 1090, through a combination of financial arrangement and internal conspiracy, he acquired the castle of Alamut, the Eagle's Nest, in the Alborz Mountains of what is now northern Iran. It was a fortress of natural impregnability, positioned on a rock formation that made conventional military assault essentially impossible, accessible only through mountain passes that a small defending force could hold against armies many times their size. Hassan would live there, barely leaving its walls, for the remaining 35 years of his life. And from those walls, he built something that no mountain fortress had ever housed before. Not an army. Not in the conventional sense. Hassan had looked at the strategic reality of his position, a small, isolated community surrounded by hostile powers that could crush him through sheer weight if they could be brought to bear, and understood that conventional military thinking was precisely the wrong framework. The Seljuks were better at conventional military thinking. They had more resources, more men, more experience in the direct application of force to political problems. Hassan needed to make the direct application of force irrelevant. What he built at Alamut was a system of belief so complete, so psychologically total, so carefully constructed to reach into the deepest levels of a person's relationship with their own existence, that it produced something the medieval world had no adequate word for. Men who did not fear death. Not in the reckless way of soldiers who have suppressed their survival instinct through training and adrenaline, but in the considered, settled, philosophically grounded way of people who had been brought, through years of religious and psychological conditioning, to a genuine relationship with mortality that removed its sting. Men who feared nothing that any enemy could threaten them with. Men who could, therefore, be sent anywhere, do anything, accept missions that anyone operating under the ordinary terms of human self-preservation would refuse. The precise nature of the psychological and theological system Hassan developed has been obscured by centuries of hostile sources, by the legend that accrued around the assassins almost from the beginning, by the notorious story, repeated by Marco Polo and dismissed by most serious historians but revealing nonetheless about how the world perceived them, of a paradise garden where initiates were taken to experience what awaited the faithful martyr. Whether the garden existed or not, the psychological reality it described was genuine. These were men who had been given a reason to welcome what other men spent their lives avoiding. That was Hassan's weapon. Not the dagger. Not the poison. The man willing to carry them to places that should have been unreachable. The Hashashin, the word that would eventually travel through Crusader French into English as assassin, did not operate the way that their enemies' military instincts told them enemies should operate. They did not mass at borders. They did not send heralds with demands. They did not appear on the horizon in numbers that could be counted and assessed and responded to with the conventional calculus of medieval military response. They did not give the fortresses and the standing armies and the layers of personal protection any of the signals that those systems had been designed to detect and respond to. They arrived first. Before the conflict was declared, before the target had been identified as an enemy, before anyone in the court or the household or the command structure had any reason to look at the quiet, competent, increasingly trusted figure in their midst and see anything other than what he appeared to be. The operational method of the Hashashin, as best as historians can reconstruct it from the fragmentary records that survive, Persian chronicles, Arabic sources, the accounts of crusaders who encountered them in the Levant, the investigations conducted by rulers who survived long enough to ask what had happened, involved an investment of time and patience that the medieval world found almost incomprehensible because it operated on a completely different timeline than conventional military action. A young man, carefully selected and extensively trained, would be sent into the world with a constructed identity. Not a rushed disguise but a life, a background, a set of skills, a religious presentation, a personality calibrated for the specific environment he was entering. He might present as a scholar, or a merchant, or a soldier seeking employment, or a religious figure of the appropriate sect. He would arrive in a city, or a court, or a military camp, and he would begin the slow, patient work of becoming trusted. This took years. Sometimes it took a decade or more. He learned the language of the region with native fluency if he did not already possess it. He learned its customs, its religious practices, its social hierarchies and their unspoken rules. He made himself useful in whatever capacity the environment rewarded, as an administrator, an advisor, a bodyguard, a servant whose discretion and competence had made him indispensable. He allowed relationships to form. He permitted himself to be known, in all the ways that the people around him understood knowing, as a colleague, a subordinate, a friend. He waited, and in a castle in the Alborz Mountains, a man with a comprehensive understanding of the political landscape of the medieval Islamic world was watching, receiving information through whatever communication channels his organization had established, and deciding when the waiting was over. The moment of activation, the transition from embedded intelligence asset to operational weapon, was the thing that made the Hashashin's enemies unable to sleep. Because it could not be detected in advance. There was no mobilization to observe, no border crossing to monitor, no supply train to intercept. The threat did not approach from outside. It was already inside, already trusted, already in possession of access that had been granted freely because it had been earned through years of patient, impeccable performance. The man who had been pouring the Sultan's wine for 3 years. The bodyguard who had stood at the vizier's shoulder through 100 audiences. The advisor whose counsel the general had come to rely on more than he realized until the moment he realized it was the last thing he would ever rely on. The gates were never breached. They were never the point. Here is what the historical record makes clear about the Hashashin's most significant victims. The list is shorter than you might expect. For an organization that terrorized the medieval Islamic world for nearly 2 centuries, that was feared by Crusader kings and Seljuk sultans and Abbasid caliphs simultaneously, that bent the political calculations of multiple empires around the simple fact of its existence. The actual number of high-profile eliminations they carried out was, in purely numerical terms, modest. This was not a failure of capability. It was the strategy. The Hashashin understood something about power and fear that most military organizations, then and now, have failed to fully appreciate, that the credible threat of action is often more strategically valuable than the action itself. That an enemy who believes you can reach them whenever you choose will modify their behavior in ways that serve your interests, not occasionally, not temporarily, but continuously, comprehensively, and at an enormous cost to their own effectiveness, without you having to do anything at all. The dagger on the pillow was more powerful than the dagger used. Because the dagger used produced 1 dead enemy and a court that grieved and adjusted and eventually recovered. But the dagger on the pillow produced something that could not be recovered from easily, the permanent, architectural, load-bearing certainty that no protection was sufficient, that the inner circle was not safe. That trust, the essential operating medium of any political system, was a vulnerability rather than an asset. Consider what this certainty did to the men it infected. A Seljuk commander planning a campaign against Alamut now had to consider, as he assembled his staff and reviewed his order of battle, whether any of the men he was relying on were something other than what they appeared. He could not resolve this question through investigation, because a sufficiently well-embedded agent would survive investigation. He could not resolve it through loyalty tests, because loyalty can be performed. He could not resolve it through the simple expedient of trusting only men he had known for decades, because the Hashashin's operational timeline was precisely calibrated to exceed the threshold of long acquaintance. He could not resolve it at all. And so it became a permanent variable in every calculation he made, a constant, low-level expenditure of cognitive and emotional resources that eroded his effectiveness in ways that were real but impossible to measure, invisible in any single decision but cumulative across years of command. Kings stopped delegating as freely as they once had, because delegation required trust, and trust had become dangerous. Sultans surrounded themselves with ever-increasing layers of protection that provided ever-decreasing psychological security, because the problem was not the thickness of the walls. Councils became smaller, their deliberations more restricted, the circle of the genuinely trusted shrinking as the consequences of misplaced trust became more vivid in everyone's imagination. The Hashashin had not conquered these empires. They had done something more insidious. They had introduced into the operating system of medieval Islamic political power a virus of suspicion that ran continuously in the background, consuming resources, degrading performance, generating outcomes that served Alamut's interests without Alamut having to do anything further to produce them. This was psychological warfare in its most sophisticated and most devastating form. And it was invented in a mountain castle in the 11th century by a man who understood that the most powerful weapon ever devised was not made of steel. It was made of doubt. The order of assassins was destroyed by the Mongols. In 1256, Hulagu Khan's forces, the same irresistible military wave that would shortly end the Abbasid Caliphate and fundamentally restructure the political geography of the medieval Islamic world, reached Alamut and reduced it. The network of castles that the Nizari Ismaili state had built across Persia and Syria was dismantled systematically, the communities scattered, the organization that Hassanai Sebah had constructed from a single mountain fortress across nearly 2 centuries of operation brought, finally, to its end. The Mongols were, perhaps, the one power that the Hashashin's methods could not adequately address. The strategy of targeted elimination and weaponized paranoia worked on political systems that were vulnerable to the disruption of individual relationships. Systems where the removal of a vizier or a general or a sultan created a cascade of instability that served the Hashashin's interests. The Mongol system was not structured that way. It was itself a machine, one built on a completely different model, and its commanders had been selected through processes that did not produce the kind of attachment to personal survival that made the Hashashin's methods persuasive. You cannot make a Mongol general afraid to sleep. But the destruction of the order did not destroy what the order had demonstrated. The knowledge that a small, non-state organization operating without conventional military resources could bend the behavior of empires through the sophisticated deployment of embedded agents and carefully managed fear, that knowledge had escaped Alamut long before the Mongols arrived. It existed in the chronicles that recorded the Hashashin's operations. It existed in the institutional memory of every court that had dealt with them, every ruler who had received a dagger on a pillow and adjusted their behavior accordingly. It existed in the word that European languages had borrowed from them, assassin, a word that needed to be invented because the concept it described was new enough to require naming. The concept was simple. An enemy you cannot see is more terrifying than an enemy you can. An organization that lives inside your institutions is more dangerous than one that besieges them from outside. Trust, the essential medium of political and military organization, is also its most exploitable vulnerability. And a single person correctly placed, correctly prepared, correctly motivated, can exercise influence over events that armies cannot reach. These ideas did not die with the order. They became the foundational architecture of every intelligence service, every covert operation, every infiltration campaign that the subsequent 8 centuries of human conflict have produced. They live in the doctrines of agencies whose names are known and agencies whose names are not. They operate in every environment where the accumulation of power makes someone a target and conventional military protection creates an illusion of safety that a patient enough adversary can wait out. The Hashashin are gone. What they understood about the relationship between fear and power has never stopped being useful. Somewhere, right now, in a court or a boardroom or a command post surrounded by every protection that money and military sophistication can provide, someone is sleeping. And somewhere else, someone is waiting. History does not bury its horrors because they are unimportant. It buries them because they are mirrors. And the reflection never quite goes away. This has been the Forbidden Archives. The files are never truly closed.